The morning comes up pale and watchful over the high country, and the wind moves as if it remembers more than it cares to say. Out here, where a wagon rut can outlive a family name, the sun lifts over a basin of sage and stone and finds a street that is no longer a street, just a run of false fronts, glassless windows, and a porch that sags like an old man's shoulders. The boards complain when you step on them. Dust rises, considers you, then drifts away. You have arrived in a town that kept its posture long after it lost its heartbeat. They called this place Bodie, short, blunt, and easier to carve into a sign than the man's original name, W.S. Bodey, who found color here in 1859 and then vanished into a blizzard before he could watch the tents turn to timber. Years later, the Standard Company struck a profitable deposit in 1876, and the whole high desert heard it. The sound wasn't the shout, it was the thump of stamp mills, the constant iron heartbeat that means a camp is learning to become a city. By 1879, people said there were thousands on this hill, streets busy with ore wagons and pride, a telegraph line humming, and a brass band that could march a man straight into trouble. The census men argued the exact number, as census men do. The boards don't bother. They only hold the memory of footsteps. Bodie sits a mile and change up in the cold. 8,300 feet of sky and weather that can rearrange a man's plans. When the first snow comes, the wind drives it like nails. When it melts, the clay swallows wheels and boots, as if the earth has its own claim to file. Yet the town learned a city's tricks quickly. A Wells Fargo office, a jail, volunteer fire companies, more saloons than any one street deserves, and the sure knowledge that distance makes a man either useful or dangerous. The telegraph lines stitched Bodie to Bridgeport and beyond. The stamp mills shipped gold by guarded road to Carson City, and sometimes the armed escort came home with nothing to report, which is the best kind of news a mining camp can hear. But before Bodie made itself noisy, this basin had already been spoken for. The winds that lift the taste of alkali from Mono Lake carry older stories. The Kutsaduka'a, the Mono Lake people of the Northern Paiute, who knew these basins as living rooms and larders long before assay offices stamped anyone else's future. They mapped springs with memory, gathered under the high clouds, traded, married, and mourned along shorelines that white paint on county maps can't quite erase. To step onto Bodie's Main Street is to step onto a palimpsest. One story written hard over another, both still legible if you look long enough. Main Street came on fast. You can almost hear the piano under the dust, the clap of a door, the glass sighing when it meets the floor. 65 saloons at the peak, that's how the papers tell it, and rooms lit late by lamp oil and decisions that wouldn't survive daylight. The rowdy reputation traveled faster than freight. Even as mothers spread quilts over straw ticks and children traced letters on slates, men settled disputes with 6 guns and a style of logic that begins and ends at the holster. Yet the town wasn't simply sin wearing a hat. It built a Methodist church and a school, roped up a brass band, and kept a calendar. Sunday service, Wednesday lodge, payday Saturday. Bodie learned to hold 2 truths at once, that the frontier will take your measure and that a town is whoever shows up to cook, fix, preach, and bury. There was a Chinatown too, right-angled to Main Street, as if to declare both connection and independence. Several hundred Chinese residents made order where chaos was a business plan. Laundries, shops, a Taoist temple, and the quiet industry that keeps a town turning while the more famous citizens practice being famous. The frontier's ledger lists their names less often than it should, but the work remains. Pressed shirts that made miners feel like men again on payday, vegetables coaxed from a mean soil, medicines, festivals that set paper light against hard sky. Before we follow Bodie all the way into its own shadow, it's worth noticing the climate that wrote the margins. Bright days can turn without warning. The east wind can slice, the west wind can shove, and when the mills pause, you can hear the altitude in your lungs. People learned to bank warmth the way they banked wages. They stacked wood cords like fortifications, chinked walls against the knife of January, taught children to skate when the ponds sealed over and to keep their gloves on when a hinge froze their skin to iron. This is a landscape that insists on respect first and money second. If you forget the order will remember you. Still, money came, and with it the furniture of ambition. The standard mill chewed through ore and spat out bullion. The body standard set type for births, fires, and brawls. A man with a watch could set his noon whistle by the mill's rhythm. Freight teams traced the same road until the road learned to expect them. The town strapped on assay houses like a gambler, buckles a belt, ready to weigh, ready to judge, ready to declare what rock is worth. Women ran boarding houses and cooked for crews they didn't love, but fed anyway. Children learned the abacus of survival. How many sticks of wood to thaw a pump? How many steps from the school to the privy in a whiteout? How many names on a prayer list after a hard Saturday night? Hold a moment at the threshold of a parlor. Faded wallpaper, a clock that forgot how to count, and a table laid for guests who never arrived. In time, Bodie would be preserved in arrested decay, a phrase that sounds like law, but feels like mercy. Keep what is. Fix only enough to let the past continue breathing. That decision, the deliberate staying of ruin, means you can still stand in a room where a felt hat hangs on a peg and decide for yourself what the last conversation was about. It is a careful kind of stewardship, the opposite of salvage, and it lets the wind conduct its tour without too much modern interruption. Of course, even boomtown pride can't outshout fire. In 1892, a blaze chewed west of Main Street and left a map of char behind. The town rebuilt with the stubbornness that defines mining folk, but it had already learned that the desert keeps a book open on everyone. In 1932, when the veins had thinned and families had thinned with them, another fire, a child's match as the story goes, ran faster than men could bucket, and Bodie's silhouette was cut down to the bones you see today. Fire, wind, and the arithmetic of ore decided the argument that law and impatience never could. You will hear legends if you linger. A woman in blue looking from a second-story pane. A rocking chair that moves when the air is perfectly still. A line some swear a child once wrote on the day her family packed for the high desert. Goodbye, God, I'm going to Bodie. Maybe that was said. Maybe it was sharpened by telling. The West is generous with stories and exact with facts, and it asks you to know the difference as you listen. What we can say for certain is that the town that learned to burn so brightly also learned to leave its rooms honest. Boots by the door, plates on the shelf, bills in the ledger, and that honesty is what haunts. Step back onto the boardwalk and look along the street. At one end, the Methodist Church holds its steeple against a sky that has outlived every argument it has watched. At the other, the Standard Mill hunches on its hill like a great animal that went to sleep in the last year of the last shift and never woke. Between them is everything a frontier needed to pretend it wasn't a frontier. Banks, unions, a newspaper, a jail, and enough Saturday night to power the rumor mill for 3 states. Families dressed for photographs. Men who didn't know they were becoming ancestors looked square into the lens and dared it to forget them. The camera didn't. The wind won't. The desert can't. And beneath the floorboards, beneath the wagon ruts, beneath the neat script of the Bodey State Historic Park map, the older story rests like a water table. Kutsaduka trails and Northern Pite words turned into English approximations. Dried plants that were medicine, a shoreline that marked seasons before anyone called them fiscal quarters. A ghost town isn't only the ghost of itself, it is the ghost of what it covered. That is the first secret in the sand, the living layers stacked under the ones we know best. When you turn to leave, the wind rises a little, amused. It will tell the same stories tomorrow, and it will hear whatever new ones you bring. Ahead lies another road, another ledger written in rope and ordnance, bravery and fear. The map names it Bannock. The winter there hangs its own noose of cloud, and where the creek bends, a gallows keeps its judgment under frost. We go because the West asks its questions in public and answers them, if at all, very quietly. At the height of it, Bodie did not so much live as vibrate. The ground itself carried a tremor from the stamp mills that never slept. Iron shoes hammering quartz to powder with the steady discipline of soldiers on parade. The rhythm set a clock for everyone, cook and card sharp, teamster and teacher. When the thumping paused, men looked up, listened for trouble, and then went on with their lives because money likes movement, and the West obliged. Main Street was a gauntlet of desire. Lamps flared behind swinging doors. The smell of whiskey, boot leather, and pine pitch made a kind of civic perfume. People said you could walk past 60-odd saloons and never hear the same piano twice. There were dance halls where the floorboards gave a little under the polka, assay houses where ore turned into numbers that could buy anything, and behind it all the Wells Fargo office, where ledgers held their breath and shotguns leaned within reach. A man could step out of a shift at the mill with his ears humming, cash his poke, and lose it again before the lamplighter finished his round. A woman could run a boarding house all day, swap the apron for a good dress at dusk, and keep a room of hard men polite by serving coffee that tasted like authority. The street was a school of appetite, and everyone studied after hours. For all the swagger, order of a sort asserted itself. The Methodist Church raised its simple steeple in the early 1880s, and on Sundays a congregation gathered in their better boots. The preacher's cadence climbing and falling, like a man who knew how hard it is to live where winter patrols the alleys. The schoolhouse opened its doors to a wide range of futures. The children of Cornish miners with names that sounded like granite, Italian boys who ran errands for grocers until they could carry a man's load at the mill, little girls from Kansas who learned their letters quickly and sometimes their caution quicker. The Miners' Union Hall stood as both refuge and rallying point, a place where speeches could be heard over the storm and where the town remembered it was more than the sum of its bars. Beyond the clink and sermon, there was a quieter city twined through the louder one. Bodie's Chinese Quarter threaded a perpendicular vein off Main, laundries with steam ghosting from doorways in winter, shops whose shelves arranged necessity with grace, and a small temple where joss sticks burned in air that understood reverence. Contracts lived here too, unwritten agreements about who cleaned, who cooked, who hauled, who mended. The frontier congratulated itself loudly for its daring and spoke much more softly about the labor that allowed it to strut. If you rose early, you could watch gardeners coax life from difficult soil, staked peas in tidy plots, green proof that stubbornness beats altitude more days than not. The town's story ran in 2 languages at least, 3 if you count the language of prices, and in all of them the verbs were work, risk, endure. Night belonged to the professionals of chance. Dealers flicked pasteboards in a way that made a man feel he was already losing before he said deal. The better houses kept faro bank and far better secrets. The worse ones kept sawdust to soak up explanations. Gunmetal made occasional punctuation marks in the grammar of dispute, but the myth that every minute ended with a funeral is just that, a myth. Most nights ended the way human nights do. Somebody laughed too hard, an old song found its chorus, 2 enemies agreed to postpone, and a sheriff walked slow and visible so people could pretend they didn't notice him. The Bodey Standard printed the next morning's version, a fight by the livery, a fire contained, a claim in the hills that might be bigger than hope. In a town so quick to kindle, it is no surprise that fire learned Bodie's map by heart. The volunteer companies drilled, their engines bright with care and short on water. Buckets passed hand to hand like a litany. 1892 left a gouge down the west side of Main Street, char where boards had been, a gap-toothed grin that the town met with stubborn rebuilding because there were still veins and still reasons. Later, when the ore pinched and the payroll did too, the second blow fell. The 1932 blaze that Child's Match in the story told most often ran faster than the men who chased it with tin pails in desperation. Flames learned to step from roof to roof in a wind that knew their names, and by the time the ash settled, Bodie was already having to describe itself in the past tense. Perhaps the origin was something else. Perhaps it was exactly that simple. A town built on tinder learns that cause matters less than consequence. What survives now is a kind of curated honesty. California chose arrested decay for Bodie, which means repair just enough to keep the forgetting slow. The effect is a stopped breath, a pool table still chalked, cue sticks asleep in their rack, a general store with tins bending on shelves under a century of dust, a schoolroom where slates wait with lessons half finished, as if the children were called out to see a thing, and the thing took 100 years. Step into a parlor, don't touch, just stand, and count the rings of silence. The clock on the mantel shows a time that never comes. A blue dress waits across the back of a chair because someone meant to mend a seam. The stair complains once and then holds its peace. Walk farther, past the church that endures, past the graves on the hillside where time does its slow arithmetic. And you meet the town's industry at last, the hulking Standard Mill, tiered up the slope like a terraced argument with the mountain. The corrugated skin rattles when the wind insists. On a cold day, you can smell iron the way a man remembers a tool he hasn't held in years. Here is where rock was persuaded to give up its yellow. Here is where sweat and acid, mercury and hope were measured until the balance turned and the future weighed less than the present. You can picture the men on the catwalks reduced to silhouettes by the dust clouds, their handkerchiefs a temporary defense against a forever hazard. You can hear an echo of the whistle, the men pausing in unison, the way work teaches people to move like a single animal. And yes, if you linger, you will hear the town talk back. Stories bump your elbow like old friends in a narrow aisle. Rosa May, say some, the woman who chose to nurse the sick in a hard winter and was buried outside the fence for her trouble. Others argue the names and the dates, but the impulse behind the tale feels true enough to make your chest ache. The goodbye God, I'm going to Bodey line travels like a weed on the wind, witty because it cuts close to bone. Whether the child wrote it or someone sharpened it later, it hangs in the air as a reminder that reputations are also residents. And among the park staff and those who sweep dust from thresholds, there are the gentler reports. A rocking chair that keeps time on a still day, a footfall on a landing where no boot ought to be, a window where a blue shape turns and is only curtain when you look again. Believe it or don't. The factual backbone of Bodey, the dates, the fires, the numbers, doesn't mind a little embroidery so long as you know where the seams are. It is tempting to call Bodey a cautionary tale about greed, but that makes the miners' wives and the children with cold hands disappear, and they are the ones who filled the town with meaning beyond ounces. Better to say Bodey is a ledger with both sides written in clear ink. On one page, skill, mechanics who could nurse bulky engines through January, cooks who could stretch a sack of flour into morale, carpenters who made a town stand straight in a crosswind. On the other, cost, forests bitten back for timbers and fuel, creeks burdened with tailings, tempers that burned as fast as brush in July. The totals don't match neatly, and maybe they aren't supposed to. The West rarely balances its books. It prefers to keep them open where everyone can see. Toward evening, the light lays gold over gold. Windows that once advertised merchandise now hold only sky. A rusted car slumps into buttercup weeds, its fenders softened by weather, its purpose long since excused. A hat still hangs on a peg because nobody thought to take it down. The wind boards up the day with the usual care, and as the chill walks in from the hills, you realize the town is not empty at all. It is populated by choices, some generous, some ruinous, most practical in the moment they were made. That is the deeper haunting here. Not the rumor of a blue dress, but the ordinary decisions that turned a ridge of sage into a city and then back again. You can stand in a doorway and feel them queue up behind you, patient as winter. When you finally step off the boardwalk, the ground accepts your weight without comment. Across the basin, a coyote slants between shadows with the arrogance of a resident. Far away, something rattles in the mill and then is quiet. A person could spend a lifetime reading these rooms and not exhaust them. But the road is waiting and the map has another mark on it. A town whose ghost wears a sheriff's star and a noose's knot at the same time. In the valley of Grasshopper Creek, a question was asked with rope instead of law, and the answer still unsettles the dust. We ride there next to Bannock, where winter keeps its own counsel and justice chose a quicker path than truth could manage. The road to Bannock runs along water that talks to itself. Grasshopper Creek comes quick over gravel, and even in winter it keeps a stubborn voice beneath the ice. Men followed that voice in 1862 when a prospector named John White washed the creek bed and found color in his pan. First a flicker, then a shine that drew tents like moss to a lamp. A few weeks more and the gulch rattled with rockers and sluice boxes, canvas pitched against a sky that took no interest in human comfort. That autumn the creek learned new words: claim, marker, boundary. By the next year, the camp wore a name that nodded to older occupants of the land, Bannock with a C where the people had a K. The town went up as if speed itself were a kind of law. Cabins notched tight, False fronts squared to send a brave face toward the wind, a Masonic lodge with a schoolroom below, a jail that looked like winter could level it with a sneeze. When in 1864, the Montana Territory took its first breath on a map, Bannock was called the capital, a word that meant pride on Sunday and paperwork on Monday. Streets in boom time have a particular music. Wagons creaked under flour and hope, picks rang on stone. Men boasted in half a dozen accents about a lead-up canyon that would make all the others look like charity. There were saloons with sawdust floors and whiskey that bit like a stray dog. And there were tables where a man could put down his week's poke and pick up a month's regrets. For those with families, the soundscape changed at the threshold. Stew simmering, baby fussing, the soft slide of a woman's hand over a sleeve she meant to mend. A town is a ledger of noises, some meant to be remembered, some to be forgotten. Out beyond the boardwalks, the lands had different names. These hills and valleys were, and are, Shoshone and Bannock homelands, a network of trails and seasons that didn't care for new borders or mining law. The creek that taught White the shape of luck had been teaching others patience, hunger, and craft for a long time. If you stood still between the knock of a hammer and the call to supper, you could feel the older current underfoot, the one that ran through language and kinship long before the first gold scale tipped in a Bannock storefront. It did not take much time for the other music to arrive, the kind made by road agents in the draws and on the stage roads. Men who knew where a coach slowed and where a rifle spoke the loudest. Gold shipments from Bannock and, after 1863, from the roaring strike at Alder Gulch on the far side of the range, traveled down towards Salt Lake City under prayer and shotgun. The frontier had sheriffs and deputies, but it had more miles than stars. And there is only so much a badge can do when the next ravine is an argument waiting to happen. One man wore that badge in Bannock with a story already pinned under it. Henry Plummer. He had the look of a handsome rogue and the limp of a past misfortune, and he knew how to make enemies into breakfast companions if the morning required it. He took the office of sheriff with a promise to bring a little peace to a town that had still to decide if it wanted peace in the first place. Plummer had supporters who swore he was trying to put the wolves on a leash. He had detractors who said the wolves were his. Winter sharpened every question. In the cold months of 1863 to 64, merchants, miners, and ranchers along the Gold Road decided that patience had become a luxury. Stage robberies had bruised their season. Killings tore holes in families. Freighters rode with the kind of watchfulness that steals sleep and adds names to a prayer list. Out of that fear and arithmetic came a committee that called itself Vigilance. Some of its leaders, later famous in print, Nathaniel P. Langford, who would write about those days with the confidence of a man who is sure he has the right of it, and Thomas Dimsdale, whose newspaper columns became a book that stamped the vigilantes as saviors, took on the task of turning rumor into rope. They drew up lists: who had been seen near which robbery, who kept company with whom, who carried a reputation that looked, in this new light, like evidence. In early January 1864, the argument leapt from page to gallows. Vigilantes seized Plummer and his deputies, Ned Ray and Buck Stinson. Snow laid a clean sheet over the town, while men gathered under breath that steamed in the cold. The beam behind the Masonic Lodge, a place that had seen lectures on virtue, now saw the quick efficiency of frontier punishment. The sheriff pleaded, or he spoke quietly and asked for a fair chance, depending on whose memory you read. The rope did its work either way. In the weeks that followed, the movement widened. Boone Helm, a killer whose name had already curdled into legend, died on a Virginia city scaffold with a joke on his lips. Others, names now mostly footnotes, were pulled from beds or hauled from horses and delivered to beams and branches across the territory. The stage roads grew quieter. Freight went through with fewer eulogies. Merchants counted cash with something like relief. But relief is not the same as justice, and the West is poor ground for conclusions that grow too fast. Even in Dimsdale's day, there were those who swallowed hard and said, "We needed it, and we will not ask for the bill." Later generations did ask. When scholars combed the depositions and reminiscences and found so much smoke and so few affidavits, a hesitancy grew. Some historians argue Plummer was a criminal organizing road agents at the same time he wore the star. A double life that would have suited a theater, not a frontier, but perhaps theaters and frontiers are closer kin than we admit. Others point to thin procedures, absent trials, enemies with interests, and the perennial temptation of power cloaked in urgency. The debate traveled beyond libraries. In 1993, Montanans staged a mock retrial of Plummer, rereading the testimonies, reweighing the accusations, the cold cases, and the human distances that separated fear from fact. The jury returned a verdict of not guilty, no statute turned on it, no rope slackened after the fact. But the performance said something about the way a place chooses to remember, that we will carry the weight of those nights not with swagger alone, but with the ache of doubt as well. What did Bannock feel like in the days between rope and ledger? Imagine waking to silence where there had been whispers, to a street where men's eyes tracked less and hands stayed closer to their own business. Imagine a hotel mead staircase, wide enough for a dress to sweep, solid enough to absorb news without creaking, bearing witness to the slow return of commerce. The hotel had been a courthouse first, brick announcing law in a country that preferred wood. When the capital moved and the county seat went down valley to Dillon, the building learned new manners and new smells, coffee, coal smoke, hair oil, before the weather had its say again. In the schoolroom, children traced words with chilled fingers, while teachers borrowed patience from reserves they did not know they had. In the jail, a cot hinged on a creek and stories piled up that no one wrote down because they were ordinary and therefore the most important. And outside it all, winter, policing the town with a fairness that owed nobody anything. Cold makes an equal of men who consider themselves unequal. It humbles the celebrated and tests the fortunate. A sheriff's star and a road agent's bravado shine the same on a January night when the wind lifts and the creek talks under ice. That is not moral philosophy. It is physics with a hint of mercy. Bannock kept at it. The creek gave, then pinched. Merchants stayed through a season, or three, or left when the arithmetic grew unfriendly. Weddings were made, births announced, graves filled in on a hill that knows too many names. The vigilantes wrote their story. Others rewrote it. The place itself, buildings, floorboards, the notch where a rope once bit, held all versions without offering an opinion. If you stand behind the lodge on a blue sky day when the air is so clear it seems to ring, the beam casts an ordinary shadow and the slope holds a scatter of rabbit track. It looks like any other hillside until you find yourself counting heartbeats for no reason you can explain. Frontier towns seldom get the luxury of choosing what they are remembered for. Bannock will have gallows in its first paragraph until people stop telling stories. But listen long enough, and you will hear the other lines too. The long chore list of a family that meant to make winter blink first, the cook who stretched venison into company supper, the stonemason who set courthouse bricks as if each were a promise to the next generation. The noose is a fact, the rest is a ledger too. When the thaw comes up Grasshopper Creek, it comes slyly. First a line in the ice where the water darkens, then a shiver under snow, then the smell of wet earth asking to be believed. Wagons roll easier. Men talk about new diggings, or about moving on to Alder Gulch, where rumor says the gold refuses to end. Women inventory shelves and barter for seed. Somewhere a deputy learns to walk without advertising it. Somewhere a child asks a question that has nothing to do with rope or gold and everything to do with the day's weather. That too is Bannock, an ordinary town with extraordinary punctuation marks. We will follow the sentence into its quieter clause in a moment. The slow fade of Gulch gold, the brief return under dredges in the 1890s, the county seat's departure, the sound of prosperity thinning to wind under eaves. But before we step there, look once more at the beam against the sky. Ask yourself what price you would pay to keep a stage road safe, what authority you would grant men who promised action over caution. Then ask, just as honestly, what part of your answer depends on being warm and unafraid. The frontier is not a place, it is a series of questions asked out loud. Bannock asked them with rope. The replies are still coming in. The thaw comes as rumor and then as proof. Ice loosens its grip on Grasshopper Creek. The sound of water grows from a whisper back into speech. Bannock exhales. Wagons return to the road with less complaint, and men stand in sunlight the way veterans stand by a window. Careful not to invite memory, careful not to refuse it. For a while, the town pretends itself back into ordinary. Laundry strung like flags of truce, flour barrels good for another week, an anvil ringing from a blacksmith's patience rather than an emergency. The vigilantes put away their masks or their bravado, depending on which story you believe, and merchants find that the sound of a till closing is easier to love than the creak of a rope. But the arithmetic of Gulch Gold is a stern teacher. The best claims go early, then deepen, then narrow to a vein that makes a man measure his days in inches instead of feet. Arguments shift from "where's the next strike" to "can we keep water out of this shaft?" And how much timber does that answer cost? The capital, which came here like a ribbon on a new suit, does what capitals do. It follows population and money. Virginia City, roaring over in Alder Gulch, takes the seat by the middle of the 1860s. The paper that made Bannock feel taller moves with it. Pride stays because pride is cheap to store and expensive to use. The town tightens its belt and learns to survive on trade, freighting, and the stubbornness that winters approve. The courthouse went up all the same. Brick in a country of board and batten. Solid enough to be a promise. Men said it on the street like an oath, a way of telling themselves the rule of paper would outlast the rule of fear. For a time it did. Then the map shifted again. In 1881, the Beaverhead County seat moved down valley to Dillon, where rail and river made a better marriage. The courthouse stood empty, a handsome witness with nobody to call to order, until a hotelier saw a second life in its rooms and christened it the Hotel Mead. Carpets replaced file cabinets. Coffee replaced affidavits. The staircase, broad and aware of its own beauty, learned to hold up dancers, traveling salesmen, and honeymooners who believed even a hard country could be softened for a night. The creek, meanwhile, worked at its old job. When the easy gold thinned, engineers brought a new appetite to Bannock. Bucket-lined dredges, iron monsters that chewed the creek bed like cattle graze a meadow. In the 1890s, they crawled up grasshopper on their own floating platforms, clanking and swallowing, turning river gravel into tailings that piled like frozen waves on either bank. The work was methodical, almost tender in its thoroughness, and it rearranged the valley the way a man moves furniture when he means to stay. Paychecks returned for a time. So did the illusion that the past could be persuaded to come around again if only you applied enough horsepower and will. When the dredges finished a stretch, the creek looked like a sentence with all the commas misplaced. The town learned to live with that grammar. Yet even a machine's patience thins. The 90s boomlet slackened into the old rhythm of staying and leaving. Some families moved on to newer camps. Others, exhausted by the loop of hope and hunger, pulled their stakes and became farmers or shopkeepers where the winters bit less hard. The Hotel Mead kept its lamps lit into the new century, its parlor full on good nights, its windows bright enough to convince the dark to keep its distance for a few hours. Children skated on the mill pond in a cold so pure their laughter seemed to shatter the air. A school bell declared mornings with brass optimism. A Masonic lodge still met upstairs above the schoolroom, where a scholar's chalk dust drifted through rituals older than the timber they met in. Walk the town now, boards silvered by 100 frosts, corners trued by men who intended their work to last. And you feel the deliberate mercy in how Bannock State Park tends its dead and its sleeping. Doors stand open to rooms that have not asked for visitors in 60 winters. The Hotel Mead holds its staircase out like an invitation to a ball that ended a lifetime ago. If you place your hand on the banister, the polish left by thousands of palms makes you a citizen for a second. The schoolhouse waits with slates set and readers stacked. On some mornings, the board still wears a date that solved a child's problem and then solved the child's day. The jail keeps its cot the way a man keeps his regrets. No longer useful, never entirely gone. The gallows beam behind the lodge has nothing to say, and yet it alters the light. The park rangers will loan you the past if you ask for it properly. They'll talk you through the Bannock Days celebration when the streets fill again with people, and a blacksmith coaxes sparks from iron while a fiddler saws a tune back into usefulness. They will remind you that this is not a movie set. It is load-bearing history, so you walk lighter, speak softer, and leave things exactly where time put them. If you wander to the cemetery on the hill, you see a familiar Western arithmetic, infant stones, mother stones, and the occasional lonely plank that apologizes for not remembering more. At the edge of town, the tailings from the dredges lie where they were left, no longer an insult, not quite forgiven, just part of the ground's new shape. It is tempting to judge the vigilantes from the comfort of modern benches. We have courts now that reach into winter without flinching. We have appeals, stenographers, and the noble boredom of procedure. But Bannock's question is not how you would act now. It is how you would have acted then, in a season when a wagon took days to fetch a judge and a murder took minutes. Langford and Dimsdale cast the rope as remedy. Later readers cast it as rashness, wearing bravery's hat. The truth, always inhospitable to absolutes, points both ways. The road did grow safer. The law grew poorer by being bypassed. A community licensed itself to act and paid with a doubt it has not finished accounting for. If you listen in the hotel mead parlor at dusk, when the floorboards crackle as the day cools, you can hear both arguments and neither conclusion. That too is part of the legacy. There is another cost the ledgers rarely balance: the land itself. Mining rearranged watercourses, shaved hillsides for timber, dusted the air with powders that lodged in men's lungs, and in the decade that followed their work. Bannock's scars are modest compared to the titans of later copper and silver, but they are evidence all the same. The creek knows them, willows root through them, trout thread between stones set by buckets rather than floods. The valley has accepted the edits humans made, and in accepting them it reminds us that forgetting and forgiving are not synonyms. By the early 20th century, the town's voice lowered. Trains ran elsewhere. The county did its business in Dillon. Good men and women died with quiet entries in family Bibles. Children folded into other places and other stories. A store stayed open, a door stayed stuck. A single pane of wavy glass held its view of the street like an old photograph that refuses to fade. Bannock did not vanish. It slowed, into a handful of families, into a checkpoint on a fishing trip, into a name local people knew as well as they knew the weather. When the state set its hand over the place and called it a park, it did so not to pinch the town in amber, but to let it continue breathing slowly at its own altitude. If a town can be said to think, Bannock thinks in winter and remembers in spring. It remembers the rope because communities remember their most decisive minutes. It remembers the courthouse because places remember what they hope to become. It remembers children's voices because those are the sounds that prove a town was more than a company with an address. And when the wind comes down from the hills in the blue hour, walking the street the way a constable walks his beat, Bannock remembers something else, something we are still learning how to say. That order is not a thing you buy. It is an agreement renewed daily by people who know one another's names and intend to keep knowing them. Stand at the edge of town as evening settles. The creek has its voice back. The first stars lift above a ridgeline that looks as sharp as a verdict. A light, battery-powered now, glows in a ranger's window. The hotel mead makes a darker shape against the sky. For a moment you can imagine a carriage drawing up, and a woman stepping down with one hand on her hat and the other gathering her skirts. Then the wind resumes its patrol, and the vision folds itself away. You have seen enough to understand what held Bannock together and what finally let it go. Tomorrow the road angles southwest. The desert begins early out there, and Nevada lays down its private kind of mirage, rhyolite, where marble and electric light tried to make a city out of sand and schedule. If Bannock was a ledger written in rope and brick, rhyolite is a set of numbers scribbled in a fever and then checked by a market crash. The train whistle that once promised everything still hangs in that air if you know how to listen. We will. The first thing the desert gives you at rhyolite is a promise. The second thing it gives you is a correction. From a rise above the Bullfrog Hills, the town finds its old angles again, avenues traced in pale dust, roof lines bitten away by weather, and the glamorous ruin of the Cook Bank standing with its arched windows like a skull that once wore a crown. Beyond it, the bottle house glints in the sun the way a joke glints when it turns out to be wiser than the sermon next to it. This place learned to speak in the language of mirage. What you see is true for a moment, and the moment is what counts. In 1904, prospectors working a scatter of claims around the newly christened Bullfrog District found ore that made the assay sit up straight. News moved faster than freighters. By 1905, capital came in with the confident stride of a man who's already telling the story of his success. Streets were platted as if the grid itself could guarantee a future. Tents turned to board fronts. Board fronts proposed brick. Brick proposed concrete. And by 1907, Rhyolite felt less like a camp and more like a city rehearsing for its close-up. Three railroads stitched the town to the wider thirst: the Las Vegas and the Tonopah and Tidewater, and the Bullfrog Goldfield. Trains unspooled silk optimism down the valley, their whistles making promises that cashiers translated into ledgers before the echo died. Electric light declared a truce with night. The power plant threw a hum into the bones of evening, and houses that had learned to make do with lamplight suddenly grew generous with shadow. Telegraph keys chattered like busy neighbors. There were waterworks, a newspaper, doctors' offices, a jail for the inevitable, and the social comfort of a place that could sustain both a red light district and a ladies' aid society without asking either to apologize. In those years, the desert indulged architecture as if it were another ore body. The Cook Bank, finished in 1908, rose to 3 stories, heavy and sure, its lobby trimmed in marble, its counters so gleaming you could mistake ambition for sunlight. Across town, the Opera House brought voices into a place better known for picks and pistols. The school opened with enough desks for hundreds of children and a bell that taught the day who was in charge. Rhyolite, like all boomers, behaved as if permanence could be bought retail. People filled in the rest. Clerks in white shirt sleeves learned to count faster. Teamsters leaned down from wagons with the private confidence of men who know they deliver the one thing every town needs: connection. Cooks made the air hospitable with coffee and onions. Dressmakers tacked new hems over old hopes. On payday, the streets braided accents from as far as Cornwall and Calabria. Money felt like weather, everywhere at once. A man with a watch could be late, but a man with a claim could be forgiven anything. Land agents drew boxes on maps with tidy hands that would soon learn to tremble. And then came the wobble that turned glory into inventory. In the autumn of 1907, banks in the East caught a panic like a fever and passed it west along the rails. Credit lines frayed. Speculators discovered that optimism does not in fact work as collateral. The showpiece Montgomery-Shoshone mine tried to pretend, briefly, that it was immune. Accountants who are hardier than hope proved otherwise. By 1910, the power plant began to falter. The rails curtailed service in the years that followed. Some trains arrived with more rumor than freight. The school released fewer students at the bell. The Opera House learned silence. The post office closed in 1919, which is a government's way of admitting what everyone else already knows. What the future left behind, the present repurposed. Lumber is always richer the second time. Bodie, just down the wash, learned to look at Rhyolite the way a clever neighbor looks at an empty barn. Opportunity stacked neatly in boards and nails. Doors and windows departed first respectfully, then joists, then whole roof lines. A city can be dismantled with the tenderness of a watchmaker if you've got time and a crowbar. And yet the Cook Bank refused to be portable. Its bones were poured stout and faced fine, and where they could not be taken, they were admired into ruin. The building stands because it knows how to lose gracefully. Not everything grand announced itself in stone and wire. In 1906, Tom Kelly, an Irish immigrant with a showman's eye, stacked more than 50,000 bottles of beer and whiskey into walls that caught daylight and taught it to dance. He set his bottle house with mortar and mischief and, once done, raffled the whole place as if permanence could be made festive. The desert approved. Bottle glass holds the morning the way a memory holds a laugh. In the right light, the house reads like a stained glass window, keeping a secular saint. It remains one of the West's frankest admissions that civilization is often built out of whatever we had too much of yesterday. Daily life during the peak is easy to romanticize. Living it would have exhausted you. The rail depots hashed the day into comings and goings. Freight yards unmuscled crates from cars and onto wagons that became small parades of necessity. Flour, pipe, dynamite, bolts of cloth. The newspaper presses clattered, turning gossip into print and print into archive, while the editor tried to decide how much of the truth the town could afford to read. On a hot afternoon, an entire block might taste of creosote and warm bread. On a cold night, the wind ran down the streets like something that paid taxes. If you walked out past the last house, the desert politely removed the city from your ears in 2 steps. Decline writes more quiet sentences than boom. Families tried to hold their ground because that is the first instinct of any household. Then they learned what other towns had already taught, that children prefer futures to memories. Board by board, Rhyolite unbuttoned its pride. Some storefronts went all at once, like old men who decide when to leave a party. Others thinned year by year, chair by chair. Electricity winked out, and the town discovered how dark real dark is, how quickly the stars reclaim a sky that had been rented to light bulbs. A few guardians stayed behind, stubborn as fence posts. They watched the place lower its voice and finally retire it. You might think the story ends there, with a ledger balanced by silence. But the desert does not believe in endings. It believes in returns. In 1984, the Belgian artist Albert Sukalski installed a set of ghostly figures near the ruins. A Last Supper in draped fiberglass that turns dusk into a kind of parable. Other pieces followed, and together the open-air museum put a frame around absence so that visitors could see what was already there. The outlines of people where people used to be, the way a town keeps its posture even after it sits down. Some purists frowned, others nodded. Art, like mining, is a way of making the unseen visible. In Rhyolite, both industries prospered for a time and left evidence an honest eye can use. What does the place say when the wind is high enough to edit your thoughts? It says that speculation is the desert's favorite joke. It lets you build with conviction and then reminds you that belief is not infrastructure. It says railroads can move promise as easily as they move ore, and that both are heavy and prone to derailments you cannot see coming. It says a town is not just its best building, but also its cheapest fence, because both rot on their own schedules. It says you can import marble and electric light and still be corrected by a market crash you didn't cause, and a horizon that will not move an inch to meet you. And yet, Rhyolite also says something kinder. It says a school bell is worth the trouble even if it only rings for a few seasons. That music in an opera house matters even when the last aria is followed by 20 years of wind. That a house made of bottles can outlast the reputation of bankers in frock coats. It says the desert remembers everything you tried to be and forgives most of what you were. If you stand in a doorway of the cook bank at late light and look toward the bottle house while the day chooses its last color, you might feel the old ambition stir, not the greed, but the stubborn human refusal to let possibility go untried. Then the wind will come up and close the ledger for you, gently, the way a clerk closes shop, with care, and a last look at the room to make sure nothing important has been left behind. Night takes the streets one after another. The arches hold a darker dark, the bottle walls catch a last glimmer like a kept promise, and somewhere a raven declares ownership with the right to be wrong. Tomorrow we will walk other ruins, Calico, Jerome, the scattered boards of places whose names fell off maps but not off memory, and ask the question that has followed us from the first plank of Bodie to the last arch of Rhyolite. When does a town become a lesson, and who chooses the subject? The answers are out there, under the tailings and the sage, patient as fossil light. The map widens and the towns grow quieter until they are almost ideas. Calico flattened to a blush of pale hills, Jerome clinging to Cleopatra Hill like a cat that refuses to be dislodged. A scatter of names the wind keeps but paper forgot. The ghost towns of the West are not a single story told three different ways. They are a choir, and the harmonies make more sense the longer you listen. Take Calico, born of silver and stubbornness in 1881, white hills veined with ore so rich a man could taste metal on his tongue by noon. By the high 1880s, hundreds of claims stitched the slopes with adits and ladders. The Silver King and her peers made daylight feel like currency. The town dressed up like any self-respecting boom. Assay houses, saloons, a school, and a newspaper that could spell prosperity without looking it up. Then prices dipped as Washington argued over silver, and the country corrected its fantasies. By the early 1890s, payrolls thinned. Men took their pick handles elsewhere. The hills learned a quiet older than English. Half a century later, a California farmer with an appetite for careful make-believe, Walter Knott, looked at Calico and saw heritage under the dust. He rebuilt streets from photographs, set shored timbers where beams had lost their nerve, and offered visitors both a history lesson and a carnival, two American pastimes that, in the best instances, improve each other. Calico would never again be a mining town. It became something harder to destroy. A reminder with a gift shop, a place where families walked streets that almost were, and learn how swiftly it turns into story. Shift east and uphill to Jerome, Arizona, a copper town that did not so much perch on Cleopatra Hill as grip it with both hands. If silver is quicksilver in the imagination, copper is infrastructure. Wire, bullet, pipe, the veins of a country deciding to be modern. United Verde and later United Verde Extension cut benches into the mountainside and made the hill smoke. The town rose tiered and tough, while below in Clarkdale the smelter turned ore into the sinews of a republic. In the 1920s, Jerome's nights were long, with pay envelopes and what pay envelopes buy. Then copper's fortunes broke ranks, and in the 1950s, Jerome stared down a population that had dwindled into a rumor. Some towns accept oblivion. Jerome refused. Artists arrived with a knack for reinvention. Galleries outlived the smelter's smoke. A sliding jail, nudged downhill by subsidence, taught visitors geology without meaning to. Hotels learned how to welcome guests who wanted ghosts with their breakfast. Jerome did not become a museum piece. It became a conversation. What do we owe the past, and how do we live in the present without erasing the debts? Between these better-known names lie hundreds of quieter places. Two shacks around a cold stove where a family wintered through one last season, a grade cut into a ridge that tells you a railroad once tried persuasion, a lone head frame like a metronome left to count the wind. Some towns enjoyed second lives, Central City and Virginia City in Colorado, and Nevada trading on their reputations until reputation paid its own way. Others like Aurora or Masonic near Mono Lake, dissolving into the ground with so little fuss that only the jackrabbits notice the exact year of surrender. The difference is rarely romance. It is geography, markets, timing, and the talent of a handful of citizens who decided that persistence counts as a skill. Look closer and you can read the environment the way you read a ledger. The West paid in timber, black hillsides cut for shafts and head frames. It paid in water, creeks diverted and rediverted until fish forgot their roots. It paid in air and lungs, dust fine enough to wear a man down from the inside. In the gold camps, mercury glossed sluices and stained histories. Later, cyanide spared muscle and taxed rivers. In the silver towns, tailings stacked like unbudgeted paragraphs, insisting that the land would remember what men preferred to forget. The scars are not always loud. Willows thread them. Mule's ear and sage learn new footholds. The desert is patient and does not bear grudges, but it also does not misplace its records. And then there is the ledger we rarely balance in public. People whose names didn't make the paper. The Chinese laundries that made miners feel clean enough to be human after a week underground. The Mexican and Basque herders who kept camps fed with meat and news. Black teamsters running ore and supplies upgrades that would make a mule rethink its loyalties. Women whose boarding houses were the invisible institutions that turned chaos into community. Children learning their letters by lamplight before carrying that light into other towns with other chances. Before any of them, and still, the tribal nations, Northern Paiute and Western Shoshone near the basins and ranges, Chemehuevi and Serrano in the Mojave, carrying a geography and language and story the maps did not bother to learn. The ghost towns sit on all of these foundations. If you want to hear the full tale, you have to listen in several keys. The ghost stories themselves, chairs that rock without wind, second-floor curtains that breathe when nobody is there, music where no saloon stands, say something even when they say nothing true. They announce that a place has been felt. We embroider the factual spine because the fit of the facts alone can be too bare to hold all we feel about effort and loss. So we dress a window with a woman in blue. We give a creaking stair a burden. We write to the dead and ask them to write back. The better parks and caretakers do not scold us for this. They set a rope at the door, post a sign that says, "Look, don't touch," and trust the rooms to do the teaching. A hat on a peg will tell you more about ambition than a paragraph ever could. What, then, are the secrets in the sand? Not treasure. We have always been too good at finding that. The secrets are simpler and more durable. That distance is not a nuisance, but a force. It shapes what a town can be and how long it can pretend. That markets are weather with numbers, and even the stoutest building cannot bargain with a crash that begins 1,000 miles away. That climate speaks last. The prairie wind, the mountain cold, the desert that keeps appointments men forget. That order is not a sheriff's star or a rope alone, but the daily renewal of agreement between neighbors whose names you know because you have borrowed a cup of flour from them and offered your last candle in return. That reinvention is an American talent we learned first on margins, when a camp ran out of ore and someone said, "What if we made art of what's left?" Or, "What if we invited strangers to walk our streets and see what we see?" Hold Bodie, bannock, and rhyolite in the same hand, and you feel three textures of the same fabric. Bodie's intensity, its piano and pistol, its winters that put a price on every loaf of bread. Bannock's rope-scarred question about haste and justice, and whether safety can be bought on credit. Rhyolite's marble ambition and the swift correction of markets that travel faster than hope. Add Calico's restoration and Jerome's artistic stubbornness, and the pattern sharpens. Towns are built on extraction, yes, but sustained by imagination. When the vein pinches, imagination either steps up or the town sits down. So where does that leave us as we walk these streets at dusk, careful not to lean on the brittle banister, careful to keep our hands in our pockets so the past can keep its shape? It leaves us with a task. Stewardship is not only for rangers. It is what any visitor performs by paying attention, by learning the names of tools and the names of people, by resisting the urge to take a nail as a souvenir and taking instead a moment to let the room say its piece. It is visiting Bodie State Historic Park or Bannock State Park or the ruins at Rhyolite with the understanding that these places are load-bearing, not just for roofs, but for memory. The sun goes down as it always has, and the boards catch a last warmth they will release in the first hour of dark. A coyote crosses Main Street with the proprietary air of a longtime resident. The sky becomes crowded with stars the way the towns once were crowded with wagers. Somewhere a bell, church, school, or imagination, rings and then stops because the day has given all it owns. The West does not hurry endings. It allows you to walk to the edge of town and look back once more. You should. The ruins look hospitable in that light, and you can almost see the people they used to house. A miner shrugging off his coat, a woman reading by a thin lamp, a child who has learned a new word and intends to spend it wisely. We began with a promise that the West remembers. It does. It remembers the clink of coin, the rasp of 6 guns, the gray patience of winter, the quick mercy of neighbors, the blunt mathematics of ore bodies, the sunshine poured into a glass bottle until the wall itself glowed. It remembers that when you build on margin, you build with both hands and with the understanding that tomorrow may ask you to start over somewhere else. It remembers enough to warn and enough to dare. So we leave the towns to their guardians, the wind, the caretakers, the polite ropes at the door, and we carry out what we can. The lesson that ambition without arrogance is worth the trouble, that order without cruelty is possible, that beauty without pretense is the one thing the desert cannot dismantle. Tell us what you hear in these streets, a warning, a benediction, or an invitation to keep walking. The sand holds more secrets. It always will.